Good morning, Mark Duffy. Jamie Briggs here from Managing Partner at PwC in Adelaide, and we welcome today Mark Duffy, the new CEO of the, well, not so new now, but of the performance unit within Premier and Cabinet. Firstly, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet, the Kaurna people, their beliefs and customs, which they hold true today. Mark Duffy, it's been an incredible 6 months since you took this new role. You've got a very long career in public policy across Australia and with South Australian roots, of course. You've seen lots of things come and go in our time in government, or your time in government, I should say. But have you ever seen a period like we've seen in the last 6 months?
No, and thanks, Jamie. And it hasn't been 6 months. April Fool's Day was when I was appointed, and I'm sure there's some pointed background to that. I think we've never seen anything like the extremes of policy response and the speed of policy response from both federal and state governments, and by and large the bipartisan approach to all of this. So it's really been as a public servant, an amazing study in politics, seeing how a national cabinet can operate, how quickly decisions can be made, and how they can be repaired if they're not perfect, and adjusted, and that frustrates business and households and creates some uncertainties. But the uncertainty of coronavirus is the biggest uncertainty of all. So, you see in both the United States and Australia that people lock themselves down when they think they're going to get sick outside. Governments, the lockdowns or the restrictions that they place on the economy and economic behaviour are often after the event that people have already responded to it. So the community is also showing enormous intelligence and compliance, even though they can see things that look like inconsistencies, and obviously when you're moving at that speed you're going to get inconsistencies. But again, those inconsistencies will be addressed, and we continue to roll on. So to me it's been a fascinating period, and the big punchline for me is, in a mixed economy you can see how the mix can change really quickly. So the government can expand dramatically into the economy, into individuals' behaviour. So we're telling people how many people can be in their houses, we're telling people how far to stand apart from each other, whether to wear masks, whether you can cross borders. But at the same time we have to think about rolling out of this, particularly if we don't get a vaccine for a long time. How do we start building personal responsibility back into this as part of the management of a pandemic? So to me, it demonstrates how the government can expand to a problem very rapidly, how the community, when they agree about the nature of the problem, can go with the government or governments, how bipartisan decision-making can take a lot of the heat and drama out of it. It's really fascinating. It's actually, it's a terrible thing, but it's also a very exciting period of history if you're interested in how government can work.
Yeah, and you've been interested, well, you are interested in how government can work and have done a lot of work in this area for a long time. To me, it strikes me as a period that we've had in Australia pretty good circumstances for 30 years, where governments have been able to manage growing economies and put in place policies to help keep that growth going. But really the private sector's taken the lead on a lot of that development. The next 5 to 10 years might not be like that. In fact, the government will play a much more important role. Do you see the dynamic nature of the last few months continuing in terms of the public service and the role of public policy in that time?
I think people who are predicting what the future looks like just around about now have to acknowledge how quickly things are changing. So just to give you two examples, the re-emergence of the virus in New Zealand makes you realise how hard an elimination strategy is. So it's an island. It's basically closed all its borders. Had 102 days without a case, and all of a sudden they've got numbers that have popped out from nowhere. So the same with Victoria. We were all tracking pretty well. Then all of a sudden, all of the borders started to close down again. We were in level 4 restrictions in Victoria. So we don't really know what the end game of this is. And the longer it goes on, the more frayed the private sector is going to get in all of this. The Commonwealth can't continue just to rack up a massive debt to fund wages and salaries and pay subsidies forever. So, the longer this goes on, the bigger the challenge is going to be for us to manage what will be a massive increase in debt, both at the federal level and the state level. But I think going into this, the Australian economy for a long period of time, productivity had been falling. We were getting very low rates of growth before the bushfires. So I think at the end of the day, that long period when we've been able to avoid having large reform programs driven by the Commonwealth and the state governments, I think we're really going to need to get back to some serious conversations about how we reform for the next part of the journey. And if you can't do it in a crisis like this, when can you do it? So we've got a recession, we've got an economic crisis, we've got a health crisis. This has got to be the time to say, what does going forward look like? And I'm pretty sure about one thing: it won't be going back. So I don't like the language of new normal, but I think there's this idea that we're just going to go back to where we were before. Well, in a sense, that journey was coming to an end anyway. And it's clear that growth is slowing, productivity was slowing, unemployment was creeping up, R&D, investment, innovation, that was kind of grinding down across the country. So time for a change, and this is an enormous stimulus to say we're going to deal with a large increase in unemployment, which will take years to wind out of. We're going to deal with the effects of eventually taking the supports off households and private businesses. That's going to have another shakeout impact. So it's a big challenge, and governments have got to front up to it.
April the 1st, you mentioned, the job that Jim McDowell asked you to do, sometime before that, leading to the beginning on April the 1st, is it the same role as what you see it today and going forward?
Well, I think this is interesting. I know that you've had a lot of conversations with senior leaders in the public sector who've got very established organisation, whether it's Attorney General or Treasury or DPC for that matter. But what we're creating is a new office here, or a new unit, and lots of work has been done on performance and public sector performance, and organisations have come and gone, and we still don't really have an integrated whole of government performance regime where the Premier can pick up relatively contained pieces of paper and say, I can see that my machine of government is operating well financially, human resources, we're achieving the goals that we've set for ourselves. So we haven't got the dashboard that gives the Premier and the public and the Cabinet and CEs confidence that the things we've chosen to do, we're moving towards them. So getting, I think part of this conversation about the future is data and data analytics, proof, information, and the management and decision-making based on objective data is going to be critical. And I think part of the exercise that we've had with Corona is the return of data-driven decision-making. Not that that's the only thing that anyone should ever take into account. You've got to deal with your history and your political culture and the aspirations of your community, and how, with governments, what principles that they were elected on. But having respect for the data, particularly as we can see, if I do X in Victoria, 5 or 6 days later, Y happens. That is to say, we increase the restrictions on movement, and then we're now starting to see dramatic reductions very quickly. So we can see that data and useful data and measurement is really important. So why don't we apply that for the whole of government? If things aren't working well, let's identify where they're not working, not to kill them, but maybe to repair them. But also, if something is working well, then why don't we work out not only whether we should be putting more into there, but also what lessons can we take out of that for other parts of government. So some people have read this job as being just a kind of a budget cutting exercise. I think data and performance is going to give us information to interrogate what government's doing. And where we can see it's successful, then we A, learn, and B, pump it up. And where things are not performing, do we repair that? What do we need? It's like a dashboard. There's a light flashing. It doesn't mean I dump the car. It means I might need to pull over and have a look at what's going on under the bonnet.
And in your mind, what does success look like? What do you think in a couple of years' time, all things being equal, how are you measuring whether this has been successful or not?
Okay, so I think the thing that attracts me to Jim's idea, and it's not Jim's idea alone, but he's got a lot of people wrapped around this idea, is that government, not South Australian government, governments everywhere are silos. And silos aren't all bad. Silos are good. You can know where to find things in silos. But if I can't make decisions which cut across silos without them joining in and giving me their information and then helping me put in place a reform or a solution to a wicked problem, if I can't do that, then government's really limited. And so I think that the success will be the degree to which the Premier can see a more integrated government. And when I say integrated, I don't think Jim means command and control. I don't think Jim wants to sit at the top of the state government and run everything, but I think what he wants to be able to say is there's a number of large, long-term, wicked problems that cut across a whole range of public sector agencies and the private sector and impact on our social and economic performance. And we need to be able to crystallise what they are, and we need to be able to bring the best minds from across the silos into a room and say, how do we collectively fix that? How do we collectively fund that? And if we can get one or two or three projects like that kicked off in the next 18 months, and everyone can say, that's a government that's working together. Yes, health is still health and education is still education, but they and others share a whole range of crossover areas where they can add value to dealing with collective problems. That, to me, is the excitement and the challenge of what Jim's setting up. A single enterprise view, but not top-down or command and control, but getting communication across the system where you need it, and getting people to focus in on how to improve the collective outcomes of government. It's a big opportunity.
Huge opportunity. I'm interested. What do you see the role of a modern public service? Do you think it's changed, or organisms always adapt to their circumstance and so forth? Do you think public service is what it is? What today is what it was 20 years ago? Is it a different calling? Is it what do you see the role and I guess the success, a public service being successful? What does it look like?
Well, I think first of all, there was a book that really impressed me about, must have been 30 years ago, Reinventing Government. And basically, its proposition was pretty straightforward, which is governments have tended to overreach, and they tend to take things on and then they never let go of them. So as a result, government gets really big and bloated. And what government should be doing is, wherever possible, they should be steering, not rowing. It's a great idea. So it basically says, I can take some resources and do something, but I don't have to do it through the public sector. So I don't have to, every approach to a problem doesn't have to be set up a new program, put some new funding, buy some new public servants. It can be, again, it goes back to the idea of if I get silos, public and private, working together, then I can have public-private responses to things, and I don't necessarily set up a permanent agency. So I think what we've got is we've got government getting big enough. The question is, are they focusing on the right things, and do they hang on to things long after the issue has been resolved or the public have no particular further need for government involvement in those areas? So part of the performance regime is to be able to say to people, how do I really prioritise? Like, I don't prioritise if I just keep adding things onto the list of things we need to do, particularly with constrained budgets. I prioritise by saying, if that's what you want me to focus on and the data says that's a good thing to focus on, then what do I have to deprioritise? And that's less dramatic if I've got a more flexible public sector. So from my point of view, the public sector that we currently live with is a public sector that's carrying some attitudes and ethoses that have actually been shaped from a much earlier period of time, and some of them don't stand the test of time. And I think one in particular, is once upon a time, I think there was a trade-off that said we're sort of exploiting people's commitment to the public by paying them lower wages, but we'll give them effectively security of employment. And what I think you'll find now, if you look at the data, is that public servants have not only got relative, if not absolute, security of employment, but they've also got faster wage growth and higher average wages and a whole lot of other bolt-ons that make it a much more privileged place to work. And I think with that privilege comes responsibility to offer flexibility and to be much more open to change, because the 75% of people who are paying taxes who work in the private sector, you're seeing it now. I mean, now is never a better time to be a public servant, generally speaking, because the insecurity of working in the private sector now is obvious to everyone. The bulk of the unemployment that we're seeing, the bulk of the rise in unemployment we're seeing is happening in the private sector. So we're asking the private sector to pay significant taxes to pay for the public service, and part of what they're seeing, I think, is a very relatively secure workforce. And I think that we've got to ask the workforce to be more flexible, to wrap around new ideas quickly. And I'm not saying that they don't want to do that, but I think we have to provide the management to do that, because it is a privilege to be a public servant right now. And it's not just the wages and conditions, it's the privilege of participating in advising governments on how to make policy and change the way we work. I mean, as you would know, politicians work really hard to get themselves into Parliament and into a cabinet, but public servants can respond to an ad in a newspaper and get to the point where they're advising politicians and premiers without any exposure to the public. So to me, it's a luxurious position to be able to advise decision makers without having to go through all the rigmarole that they have to go through, get elected every 3 years, and you know better than I do how tough that gig is.
Is there a better, an improved way to interact with the private sector and the public service to get a better understanding of both motivators and I guess particularly right now when government's playing a bigger role, as you mentioned, in supporting the economy through this crisis and will for a period of time. There's often the commentary around the public service doesn't understand business and business doesn't understand the public service. Is that an observation you think is true? And if so, is there things that you think can be done to improve that?
I think it's absolute. I think it's relatively true, and it's more true depending on what part of government you look at. So I think it's a safe generalisation to say that the people who work at state level, particularly since we've owned at various periods of time, we've owned hospitals, schools, power stations, water utilities, banks, insurance companies. Basically, at the state level, public servants have been much closer to business for a long period of time. At the Commonwealth level, they've got the money and they've got all the PhDs, but they don't have, on average, the same level of exposure to the business community. So I think one of the biggest problems I see with the Federation is that there's a mismatch between people who look at the world through models and people who much more look at the world from actually years of practical experience running businesses or being close to people who run businesses. Having said that, I think there's a lot of ways where we can engage the public sector and the private sector in policy making. So one of the things that I've inherited, which I'm really excited about, is a thing that was set up by the previous government. I think this Premier likes the potential of it, a thing called the Innovation Lab. And it's as much a way of thinking as is a physical location. So it's basically just trying to bring people in around particular issues from a range of different perspectives and try and analyse that particular problem openly and get insights into how we might improve a situation. And I would like to start to use the lab to bring the private sector much more in with the public servants to look at large challenges, whether we're looking at what infrastructure moves could we make with the Commonwealth, the state and the private sector to, say, increase our water supplies to new mining and agriculture. Big projects that you can't do on your own, but if we look at what the demand might be and we look at the capacity and the interests of both the public and the private sector to partner up to do some of those things. So I think we can deal with public sector problems and bring private players into the room, but we should also be looking at private sector challenges and how we can use the public and the private sector, the best people from that area, to sit down and say, how do we nut through this? So yeah, I think I've got a tool, and I think that's a big part of what I'm going to try and look at, which you may call public sector reform. It might be partly public sector reform, but it might be actually just knitting players much more closely together and seeing that if I stack up a whole bunch of interests, if I stack up ag interests with mining interests, with other interests, I might find that we've got solutions to problems which BHP or SA Water on their own can't resolve.
And in that respect, access to talent, is that, again, we've been in a tight labour market where it's been, more of a choice of the job that people want to take. We're entering into a labour market where people are going to have far less choice about jobs they'll get access to and so forth. Do you think that will be a benefit in a sense for the public service? There'll be more interest in, as you talked about, it is a good time to have more secure employment and so forth. Do you think that'll attract more graduates, more people who are thinking maybe they would have gone to a private sector firm before, and in fact public service becomes more attractive?
Well, it's sort of, economics has become fashionable again. There's a long period of time when economics was not really interesting because apparently, we might have been, frogs sitting in hot water, but we didn't really notice it. So economics all of a sudden has become interesting again, and I think that's because it's relevant. And I think we're all seeing at the moment how powerful and integral government is to the operation of a market system. So, really that's the point. When markets are running smoothly, you want to back the government out of it. But markets, in this case, the markets were pushed into a coma by deliberate public policy. So government has to be there to bring them out of the coma. But I think it makes, heroes, who are our heroes at the moment, they're public servants who are doing an incredible job and getting results, and people can see the results. I mean, it goes back to data. We're measuring what they're doing. We're doing it almost in real time. We've got the scorecards coming out pretty much every day about how different jurisdictions are dealing with this, and they're public servants and politicians making really big calls with the data they've got in front of them. So you're really seeing the capacity rather than the government kind of sitting back because the economy's going pretty well and there's no major drama. So I think that will stimulate people. I think the other thing that we should really think about, and this is what I probably find most exciting, so I don't go to the Treasurer and ask for more money, and I don't complain if people take money off me in other agencies, because I see an enormous elasticity in people's capacity if you enthuse them. And I think that what we really need to do, and it's not a criticism, everyone, it's just my own experience, is if you can get people enthused about the fact that you've got a plan, you've got a problem, you look like you've got the capacity to move it through, and often you don't, by the way. If someone complains that the government asked me to do something and then we did it and then they didn't want to do it, well, that's their prerogative, because you come up with an answer which is not palatable, or the caravan has moved on, or whatever. So everything you start, you don't finish. But that's not a reason to be disappointed because reform is really hard, and lots of reform has been tried, and we all know it. Whether you look at energy reform or environmental reform, these are really, really hard things to crunch out. So lots of work has been done on a whole range of policy areas that we haven't been able to implement. But the thing is, if I create a circumstance for people to get enthusiastic and jump into a problem, it's amazing how it's not work, it's a pleasure almost. It's like this is not working when I'm enjoying what I'm doing. And I think if we can create more of that vibe, I just think there's enormous elasticity in the existing public service. If we create the right rooms for them to be able to operate, that we're going to get a lot more out of people. So I don't think we're constrained by intellect. I think we haven't yet worked out how to fully exploit and enthuse people and let them take chances and give protection in rooms for them to have politically incorrect conversations or politically risky conversations, knowing that sometimes I've got to kick an idea around, which may raise some uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary for us to unpack something. So I'm very excited about every time I work with a group of people, and it doesn't matter what their rank is, you get this level of enthusiasm to jump into something if you give them a sense that they're going to achieve something.
Part of these interviews, the members get to write in some questions, and some of the issues we've covered already. But one which is really interesting, I think, and I know you've got views on, and will be impactful for Australia in the next 5 to 10 years, is our relationship with China. And we saw yesterday another step in that deterioration with potential impact on our wine industry and so forth. How do your crystal ball, where does this go, and does this change Australia structurally? Do we rely too heavily on China and this is a moment to start to rethink that, or is this a blip? What's your view about that?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand the difference between responsibility between the state and the federal government, and actually difference between bureaucrats who've got nothing to do with foreign affairs and politicians. But if I've made that qualification, though, I've got no right to speak on this particular matter, except to say that, first of all, I think the issues between the United States and China that Australia as a nation is necessarily stuck within, an ally of long standing versus a really important economic force in the region, that's really important for Australia. So we're in the middle of a tricky thing, but I think the message is at the state level and at the business level, we continue to do what we do, and that noise, that diplomacy, that international conversation that's going on, it will disrupt what we're doing, it will disrupt what our businesses are doing, but it shouldn't deflect them from the fact that no one is saying that whatever that noise is, that business is not continuing to occur. So that's the first thing. And it's an important business, and everyone says, let's not put all our eggs in one basket. And who doesn't disagree with that? The only thing is, where's the other baskets, right? So we need to build up other baskets, but they're not as apparent. We haven't seen any other nation do what China has done in the last 30 years. And I went to a seminar in Canberra a few months ago, and one senior Commonwealth bureaucrat said, have we had a conversation with the public of Australia about what it looks like if we withdraw from economic relationship with China, and how big our recession will be and how long that will last? Well, that was before coronavirus. So I think we need to recognise as a state and individual businesses that that's a conversation that will go on for a long time, that these are big movements in history, and we've got to build an economy around that. So from my point of view, South Australia, if we look at, I think Raymond Spencer came up with this line. I'll give it to him if he didn't. It's a really good line. We're not going to be the breadbasket of Asia, but we'll be the delicatessen. So if you've seen the fastest middle classing in the history of humanity going on in China, then they're moving up the food chain, and all of a sudden Maggie beer and quality red wine and quality seafood and all these other things, plus tertiary education and tourism. International education is our biggest export, and China has been a part of that. So, do I think China is important? Yes. Do I think it's impossible to continue to relate to them? No. It's absolutely necessary for us to continue to trade and have commercial relationships with them. But I do think that everyone would be aware that we have to broaden out our export focus, but that's easier said than done. And I think the other thing to say, generally, particularly for South Australia, is we shouldn't necessarily be obsessed about selling things over the international border. If I sell something into Victoria, if I sell something to Queensland, as far as I'm concerned for South Australia, that's export, and it's also a stepping stone. So I've got businesses in South Australia who would be much better off learning how to professionalise their business and sell goods and services to other states in Australia. We've got the same language, the same laws, the same time zones, etc. And once I can do that, then that's my primary school. Then I start going out and working out how I can sell into other jurisdictions. So I think to some degree, some people think that export means I've just got to get straight from local production into international trade, and I think we should, wherever we can, assume that trade to other states, given that all the borders are closed, they pretty well have become other countries anyway. But I think it's important.
Got what they wanted. Yeah. While you've got your crystal ball and you're reading through it, where are we likely to be at in 12 months' time in South Australia? What do you see the path for us through?
Well, I think first of all, you know that you were involved in some of the early economic discussion we had, and I think we identified the number one issue was confidence. Because if people aren't confident, they're not going to spend, they're not going to employ, they're not going to invest. And I think it's pretty clear that through a whole lot of circumstances, including really good political communication and public sector delivery. So on the health side and on the communication side, we in South Australia feel like we're less repressed than any other state. I think that's probably fair to say. So just go around the map. Western Australia's borders are closed, and they'll be closed for the foreseeable future. Maybe they're saying till mid next year. Queensland basically closed their borders to pretty well everyone until further notice, but maybe not until Christmas. I think Tasmania's closed till Christmas. We don't need to talk about Victoria. That's in level 4. Yet South Australia is open to Western Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland and Tasmania. On the streets, we've got basically no community transmission, and that's a really good base for us to build from, right? So we should be the first out of the block here, and we need to be, because as you know, for the last 20 or 30 years, on average, we haven't grown at anywhere near the rates of the other states. I was in Brisbane a couple of weeks ago, and in 1962, Brisbane and Adelaide was bigger than Brisbane. And if you go to Brisbane now and you go, wow, that's what 30 years of rapid growth will do to you. And it doesn't mean that we want to be Brisbane, but it does show that we need to come out of this with a new conversation about how to really look at the value of South Australia now. And so, being a glass full kind of a guy, we've got the most livable city in the world with a great health stamp. We've got good IT. We're going to have pretty good rental availability, I suspect. We've learned in Melbourne and Sydney that we can work remotely. So Adelaide, why would you go to a country town if you can come to a capital city with a brand new hospital, the best airport probably in the world, 15 minutes from the CBD. The story about South Australia is now better than it's ever been, weirdly enough. You can see in the property markets, you can see people in Melbourne and Sydney really starting to say the density of this is starting to be repressive. The congestion, the cost of living, and now this kind of potentially ongoing health thing, whereas a decentralised community with a sense of responsibility. I mean, we've got it's not blindly discipline. There's a serious debate going on out there, but collectively we've managed to get ourselves to this point. And so now we should be saying, how do I leverage off the best place in the world to live with a whole lot of other things going for it in a world where remote learning has now become remote learning, but remote working has now become an accepted thing. So I think that we need to look at how we build a new story of Adelaide. The university story has been generated again. I think the new Chancellor of the University of Adelaide has basically responded saying that she believes her institution's up for that conversation. I think if we have that conversation, we've got to build the case for why we want to build international-sized education institutions here, what would be the costs involved, what would the economic value of it to the community, not just to the institutions, but to the broader community. But going back to international students as being our biggest export, if I was increasing our attraction for research dollars, if I was increasing our attraction for higher quality internationally respected academics, if I was increasing our attraction to international students, being the Boston of the Southern Hemisphere, we could do worse than that. As a community, if we decided that was a story that we wanted to tell about ourselves and what our mission was. So I think these are big questions, but I think we should be unpacking them now, because that we're looking at what we should be looking at is a period to regrow and rebrand the place, and this is the window's open for us to do it.
Mark Duffy, thanks for your time.
Pleasure, thank you.